Thank you, Flame University. Thank you, TED. I'm going to start this story of about 40 years back when I was in high school, growing up in New Delhi, which if any of you has stayed for more than a few days would know how horrendous it is. You want me to? Okay. Oh, on here? Yes. Okay, the red carpet. If any of you spend time in New Delhi, or actually for that matter in Pune or any other major city in the country today, you would know that things are pretty horrendous. You can't breathe the air, you can't drink the water, etc., etc., etc. So I was growing up in New Delhi in the late 1970s, early 80s, seeing the city becoming worse and kind of feeling the concern that I'm the one growing up in this city and need to live in this for the next few decades. And is it okay for me to just kind of see this going, from bad to worse, or should I be doing something about it? One of the things we used to do back then, I was into animal rights, wildlife, generally enjoying nature, and one of the loveliest pieces of New Delhi, which most people don't know about, the last part of the Aravalli forest range called the Ridge, is where we used to enjoy ourselves going and doing bird watching or just having nature walks, but at the same time seeing the destruction of this forest for garbage dumping and expressways and building construction and so on. So we decided to do something as students, as high school students. We kind of took up a rally and a demonstration and approached the civic administration to say, look, we need to protect this as the lungs of the city, as something that keeps the city a little bit saner than it otherwise is. This was the beginnings of a long journey for the last 4 decades of working on broadly environment and development issues. Very soon after that, we actually had heard also about the Chipko movement. Many of you would have heard a bit about it. So we went up into the Tehri Garhwal hills and did 2 long treks, which was enjoyable as trekking also, but also meeting up with a lot of the Chipko movement people, learning about why they have this movement to protect the forests of the Himalaya. And then we did a long trek along the Narmada River, a 50-day walk from or a journey from the mouth to the head, to the source of the river, trying to learn about the river, its people, its environment, and what would happen if the 10 big dams that were being proposed on the river actually did come up. This is back in 1983. Through these and many other different journeys, working on these sorts of issues, trying to learn more, trying to enjoy ourselves, but also be concerned about what was happening to these areas, we learned, it came more and more into my head and the head of my colleagues that there's something desperately wrong about development, the way it's being conceived of then and now. That development which actually eats up nature on which all of us depend, and which displaces and dispossesses people who are mostly dependent on nature, there's something wrong. There's some basic fault in this, right? And this is the kind of work that we started doing more and more. So even if you look at this advertisement, which is an Indian multinational corporation, the text there says, all over the world, nature's mighty barriers stop us from development. Now, since when is nature a barrier? I mean, we'd all be dead without nature, right? Oxygen is created by nature. But that's the way we look at development, and we felt that there was something wrong with it. We also realized through this early few years that it wasn't just in terms of destroying trees and tigers and so on and so forth, but also in terms of destroying the livelihoods of people. And we've seen the kind of horrendous inequalities and social deprivations and material deprivations that this form of development has caused. In India alone, 60 million people have been displaced by development projects in the last few decades. And you see these inequalities every time you go into any city or in any village. So increasingly we became part of resistance movements that were protesting, that were saying, no, this is not the way to deal with our lives and with nature, that we are not going to give up our land, we're not going to give up our water, we're not going to give up our forests for what you say is development. By you, meaning the government or economists or private corporations or the World Bank or whatever it is, right? So we were part of these resistance movements, and for the last few decades, I have and my colleagues have been part of this resistance movements, but increasingly we've also felt a bit of frustration, a bit of restlessness about this constant mode of saying no. No to dams, no to mining, no to XYZ, right? What is it that we're saying yes to? Go 30 years later, 2012, a colleague and I wrote this book called Churning the Earth. We were looking at what was the impact of globalized economic development in India. It's a 400-page book. 300 pages of it is the bad news. It's all the negative impact, social, cultural, ecological, economic, on the people of India, on the environment of India. And then there's 100 pages of what we think is the good news, which is what is it that people are doing in terms of the responses to this kind of destruction and devastation and displacement, in terms of creating alternatives, not just resistance, but also creating alternatives for how do you meet people's needs and aspirations without causing the sorts of problems that the model of development does. Now, when I was part of writing this, I was saying that why is it that that only 1/4 of the book is on alternatives? We need to focus much more on this, the yes part of it, the solutions part of it, the positive part of it. And so began a journey to start looking at where people are actually doing this kind of alternative work in different fields, not just in environment and conservation, but in gender, in food, in energy, in health, in learning, in governance, in politics, in all kinds of things. How is it that people are trying to actually create new narratives, new stories, change the situation on the ground for themselves and for others by doing things that are more sensitive to people and to nature, to the rest of nature, right? So this was a journey that started a few years back and has increasingly been consuming most of my life, more than actually looking at resistance. So just to give you a couple of very quick examples of things that have really inspired me. This is an organization of Dalit women farmers in Telangana, which over the last 30 years has moved from a situation of food insecurity and hunger and so on into being what they call food sovereign, which means that they have complete control over everything to do with their food, the land, the seeds, the water, the energy, etc., right? But along with that, they've also created their own community media center, their own community radio, their own filmmaking unit, their own school, essentially trying to transform their lives and transform not just the food and the water and the energy and so on, but also their status as Dalits and as women. So there's like a gender revolution, there's a caste revolution taking place in this village, in these 65-70 villages. Another example I've been very inspired by is an Adivasi village in central India called Medhalekha, which started 30 years back as part of a resistance movement against big dams, and then moved into what they call self-governance, into saying that, okay, while we elect the government in New Delhi and Mumbai, in our own village, we are the government. Nobody does anything without asking us. And this kind of movement for what is called direct democracy or radical democracy has spread rapidly in many different parts of the world, where people are saying, even in cities, saying if planning has to happen, if budget has to be made for us, why is it that only politicians and bureaucrats make those budgets and make those plans? We should be part of making those plans. And I would say the same thing with students, that you should be part of making the curriculum. Sorry if I'm creating any problems for the faculty here. But really, democracy is about rule by the people, not rule by people who we elect. And we've forgotten that. We think that democracy is only going to elections once in 5 years. No, it's not. It's about us being part of power wherever we are, but being part of power in a responsible way towards others and towards the rest of nature. That's what Swaraj, for instance, was. Swaraj was not just about freedom from the British. It's really about being autonomous, free, independent, but in responsibility towards others. So, and the third example, which is from a city in Goa, a very recent one, where two young people have started a complete non-waste shop. You can go there, there's got no packaging, none of that horrendous, incredibly wasteful packaging that everything that we consume these days comes in. You go there with your own barani or your vessels or whatever it is, and they will refill it with dal or pulses or rice or whatever it is that you want. These are the sorts of examples, and there are hundreds and thousands of them actually around the country, that are inspiring us to think differently from what the mainstream model of development is. The problem with this is that all of these different examples from around the country, and as I said, there are thousands, are scattered. They're not necessarily connected to each other. They don't even necessarily know about each other. Most of us don't know about most of these examples. The people who are part of them themselves don't crow about it. They don't go to the media. Media mostly ignores them, etc. So we need to do something to actually start connecting, to make people know about these sorts of things and be inspired by them and do things themselves. So this is why we started a few years back a process called the Vikalp Sangam. The Sangam is a sacred space. 2 rivers or 3 rivers meeting together is always a sacred space in India. This is a space for ideas and practices to be coming together. It's a space where people who are working on livelihoods, people who are working on gender, people who are working on justice, people who are working on conservation, people who are working on health and education can come together and collaborate and learn from each other and spread these sorts of initiatives, alternative initiatives further. This idea started a few years back. It came from a very famous linguist called Professor Ganesh Devi, who had organized a Bhasha Sangam, where about 500 languages, people from 500 languages came together in Gujarat. When he spoke about the Bhasha Sangam, it came to me saying, why not do a Vikalp Sangam also of people who are working on these sorts of alternatives. So we've had about 12, 13 of these Sangams where people come together for 3, 4, 5 days and do these exchanges and collaborations and joint visioning of what would be a better India. From this initial few years, the idea has spread. We had last year a Vikalp Sangam in Lebanon, where people from 4 or 5 countries of that very troubled region, which all the superpowers of the world want to capture because of oil and so on, coming together and talking about not just the problems, but also what are the alternative initiatives towards peace, towards livelihoods, towards conservation and sustainability. We started documenting many of these examples, and we started this website called vikalpsangam.org, which now has more than 1,000 stories from different parts of India. If any of you is ever feeling depressed, just before the exams or whatever it is, take a few minutes, go to this website, you'll cheer up, because there's really good stuff happening, even in the midst of course, a lot of bad news. We then realized that it was not just in India that this was happening, it's happening across the world. I spoke about Lebanon just now. Across the world, you will find different sorts of things happening. Let me just stop for a second here and ask you, what's the first thing that you felt when you saw this map? That it's upside down? But why? The world is round, no? Any particular reason that Europe needs to be on top? Let's decolonize our mind. It's part of the alternatives movement, is to decolonize our minds. The map that we're so used to is a map that was given to us by colonial powers. Get rid of it. Think about different ways of looking at the world. This is how we can look at it. This is the actual sizes of the continents and the countries, where in fact, England disappears. You don't even see it anymore, right? But other reason I'm showing this is to just put out a few terms of movements and initiatives in different parts of the world, which are kind of similar to what's happening in India, where people are trying to reclaim their lives, their dignity, the democracy that should be at the local level, the economic control that should not be with private corporations and government, but with us, and so on and so forth. There's many, many things happening around the world which are incredibly exciting. So from this has also then the Vikalp Sangam process, as I said, Lebanon, has also now spread elsewhere, and we're beginning to talk about a global confluence of alternatives. That doesn't mean one humongous meeting of 50,000 people somewhere with all the carbon footprint, but it means movements of this kind in different parts of the world beginning to exchange ideas, exchange experiences, learn from each other, maybe occasionally meet also face to face, have exchanges of the Dalit women farmers from here maybe going to the potato farmers in Peru, where they are conserving 3,000 varieties of potato, and they coming here and learning from each other in spaces that are kind of similar. You all have experience for learning, you all have the opportunity of learning. Many of these people don't have those opportunities. It's for people like us to be able to facilitate that kind of exchange program. So the idea is to actually have a global, many different global confluences, and in that sense, it's not one butterfly that is having that effect. It's actually many, many different butterflies that are coming together to create that storm. And I think that's really a crucial point that we're making here. It's not about one idea that upscales and so on. It's not about one corporation that upscales. That's the sort of normal business idea that we have. It's really about saying everybody has the potential of creating these stories. Can we get together and create that larger story where it's still decentralized but also coming together? So to my mind, in fact, the butterfly effect is precisely that. And finally, it's also about dreaming. It's about saying that we should find the time to sit back, reflect, and envision a different world, to create our own utopias collectively, to then see how do we work towards those utopias, to think about alternative futures where we get unshackled from caste and gender inequalities and unsustainability and all the stuff that kind of shackles our minds and our hearts. How do you unshackle those? How do you create the different narratives? How do you create a pluriverse, not a university, but a pluriversity, where there's different ideas flourishing, but having maybe a common set of values of solidarity, of generosity, of kindness, of love, of empathy, of radical empathy, being able to come together into a pluriverse, a world with many worlds. So I've been very lucky to be part of that also. These are two new books that have come out or are coming out, which kind of put a lot of this kind of experience together. Hopefully, this process that is happening across the world will lead us in its own small ways to a world that's saner, more pleasant, less scary, more safe, and sustainable and equitable and just for everybody, including all of nature. Thank you very much.